Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Mass Exploitation, How to Defend the Next Log4j, sponsored by Gray Noise. My name is Carol, author of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Andrew Morris, founder and CEO of Gray Noise, and Brad Laporte, Gartner veteran, industry expert, and strategic advisor to Gray Noise. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to our presenters.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So as stated, Brad Laporte, a little bit about me. Gartner veteran, certainly covered this space extensively while I was there and previously at Dell and IBM. One of the two largest managed security service providers in the industry. And, you know, I got to say, it's a pleasure. I'm here with Andrew Morris, the founder and CEO of Gray Noise. So, you know, if you want to say a few words.
Hey, folks, my name is Andrew Morris. I'm the founder and CEO at Gray Noise. Really excited to be here. Really appreciate you all coming to listen to us talk. Yeah, so I mean, this is my job. Prior to this, I was in security research for many years and working as a security consultant. So long-time technical background, long-time internet listener, also long-time internet caller. So anyways, very happy to be here. Excited to get started. Folks, if you guys have questions about anything, pop them in real time. We'd love to get them answered for you. So anyways, Brad, please proceed.
Absolutely. And we'll go full bore at the end as well. So let's dig in. So one of the things that really handling, you know, literally hundreds, thousands of conversations over the years with clients, buyers, users, investors, everything in between. One of the things that really kind of comes up time and time again is really understanding and quantifying the pain that it takes for a SOC analyst, you know, what they go through on a day-to-day basis. And you know, why is it that the past 2 years and really the past year have been so different and so, you know, significantly more difficult than they've been in previous years, and really going past, you know, 10, 20 years ago. And, you know, what I'm going to do in this webinar as we start off is kind of set that foundation and set that forward and kind of highlight, you know, really what's happening here. And the most important thing that I want you to take away is the sheer amount of data that is just overwhelming, you know, not only SOC analysts, but also, you know, anyone that works in IT, anyone that even on the business side of the house, you have business analytics, it's almost like a Venn diagram on top of a Venn diagram on top of a Venn diagram. And, you know, literally every 4 years, the amount of data that we're processing is doubling. So it's, you know, as we do this webinar again in 4 years, let's set the date. Like we're going to see this go even further, you know, going all the way up to the Empire State Building. So if you think of the way that things were, you know, 20 years ago, so let's just, yeah, if you remember like SIM days, when the SIM first came out in 2006, we were really just operating on the concept of it, you know, being the gigabyte error. I mean, that was on the magazines everywhere. And now we've evolved into the zettabyte error and the amount of data that these organizations have to facilitate on a day-to-day basis. And you can imagine like the amount of, you know, pure data that your SIM has to monitor and all the different security tools and IT tools that you have. You know, it's literally like trying to suck a cheeseburger through a straw. I mean, it's just impossible to get that much information through. And the poor SOC analysts are trying to process through this stuff. So you know, we've gone from the proverbial, you know, trying to find a needle in a haystack and evolving it into like, now I have this giant, massive amount of hay that's just crushing my soul. And you know, that's really just how things have evolved over time. And on top of all of that, you know, the amount of vulnerabilities have gone up exponentially as well. So you know, vulnerabilities and vulnerability exploits in related attacks, whether they be the primary source or a secondary action, is the #1 attack vector that you have, that threat actors do to enter into your environment. And this is a tricky area because it's not just about the critical vulnerabilities anymore. It's everything from the low all the way up to the critical and all the different levels that are there, because threat actors are using automated tools now more than ever. The barrier of entry from a criminal perspective is limited purely to whoever has access to a keyboard and to the internet, and can basically come in and do the automated scanning and with minimal effort. And it's gone from a spray and pray perspective to now being able to be surgical and exploiting different opportunistic attacks, as we like to call it, where they're actually able to go after celebrity vulnerabilities, go after these different components, and go after these vulnerability exploits, from the point that it's first been disclosed. And from a vulnerability management perspective, when you're continually doing your patching, you get a patch, patch, go as quickly as you can. And that's the general best practice that comes out of CISA, the Critical Information Security Agency, and the NSA, and similar three other organizations out there that have the actual guidance to tell you this is what you got to do on a day-to-day basis. And the challenge is that it's not just addressing that one vulnerability, it's everything rolling up to that point. It's all the things that are from low all the way up to critical. And unfortunately, the not only is the volume of the vulnerabilities going up, but it's also the sheer severity that's gone up exponentially. And I wish I had updated numbers here, but over the past 3 years, because this only goes up to 2019, given the primary research that we did on this from the source of IBM, going through and looking at all the different vulnerabilities that are there, the number of criticals have gone up exponential as well. And like I said, there's more of this island hopping where they're leveraging the lower elements. So let's double click into that. And having run multiple SOCs, from a Department of Defense perspective, Dell SecureWorks at IBM, these are what was consistent a long time ago is still consistent today, and the pain is still there. It's still all about patching, detection, and response. And the SOC spends a lot of time, over half of their time is evaluating false positives. And really it's just, they don't have a clean funnel coming in the first place. And the amount of data that ends up being added, from different remote users and remote devices, bring your own device, IoT devices, Industry 4.0, and crossing the spectrum across operational technology and everything in between. Everything has a heartbeat now, a network heartbeat, and all of that is producing logs, is all producing events. And the mass majority of organizations that have moved to the cloud, which is the de facto standard now, is all, unfortunately, a large portion of it ends up being internet facing. So the way that we protect our attack surface used to be myopic. It used to be a single point, a single perimeter that we had to worry about. Now we have to worry about hundreds of different attack surfaces that all have their own various levels of complexity, their risk for misconfigurations, and all those different things end up introducing risk that just hasn't existed in the past. So, this is the pain. This is kind of a lot of the reasons and heartburn that security analysts have on the back end, and unfortunately has contributed to the movement that's being called the Great Resignation. A lot of SOC analysts are burnt out. They're fed up. They've unfortunately not been supported by their leadership, and it's becoming like its own pandemic and its own issue across the board. Being on call 24/7, 365, having alert fatigue is a major issue, where they're just overrun with this overwhelming amount of hay, and being able to have information overload. There's over 2,800 vendors, security vendors in the space that they have to evaluate and contend and do various different things, where the marketing gets incredibly confusing, especially in the threat intelligence space, where there's over 130 different vendors, and a lot of them do a lot of the same things. And that's coming from a Gartner analyst that was one of the lead authors on a market guide at Gartner. So I can tell you that the complexity and the overall chaos that exists in the SOC is very real, and it's very here. Now, in terms of the actual exploits, so when we talk about vulnerability exploits and different types of attacks, what does that mean? Let's break that down into individual components. And I mean, there's no surprise here. Malware attacks and the actual, with malware being a payload, a subsection of that, being ransomware. Ransomware itself is over 1/3 of the attacks. The main entry points end up being reconnaissance and the initial attack, and basically exploiting. Over 80% of SOC analysts say that vulnerabilities and vulnerability exploits as being a major entry point, along with contending spear phishing. So you combine that with credential stuffing, leveraging different zero-day attacks and different web-based scanning attacks that end up being like in distributed denial of service, different types of web scraping to identify these different vulnerabilities and weak points. All these things come down to really the initial entry point and the initial, it's the kill chain or the MITRE attack framework where you're actually evolving into that. So quite interesting in terms of the evolution here, because for many years phishing was certainly a top way that threat actors ended up entering into an environment. So in terms of standards, NIST just released their latest update on the enterprise patch management, their standard of this is the de facto standard in terms of where the baseline is and where you should be as a mature organization in addressing your vulnerability management. And just to address a critical vulnerability in your environment that is targeting an asset of high importance. So in the bottom right, basically the average time to remediate that is 5 days. And I'm going to tell you full stop that is grossly inadequate. And the reason why is threat actors are literally being able to respond in terms of minutes. In terms of minutes and hours, they're already scanning the internet and basically identifying the different weak points and taking advantage of this opportunity that exists, that hey, this disclosure's come out, there's no patch yet, and organizations are exposed. And that's ultimately what ends up happening. And if you marry that up with kind of where everyone is as an organization, we have a long way to go. And it really requires us to leapfrog our existing understanding of how we combat these types of security incidents and being able to not only detect, but respond and remediate those. I mean, over 40% of organizations, it takes them months to actually respond to a single incident. And then it's over 78% that basically it takes weeks or longer. So only a very small fraction of 20%, rounded numbers, of course, that are actually able to do it within days and actually meet that standard, the standard that NIST has put forward. And really what we're going to talk about in here is how you can leverage gray noise to, and kind of these best practices that we're going to walk through on how you can actually, get an early warning sign, just like a tornado is going to come through and potentially, damage your home, and you'd like to have that early warning, that alarm, that siren that go off and say, hey, this is not right. So what we have here is just to use a very simple example, which we'll do a deeper dive into, specifically Log4j, which is a celebrity vulnerability that came out in December. And within literally hours of this vulnerability being disclosed, threat actors were already doing scanning within the environment. We saw it again within Spring for Shell. So when Log4j came out, there was literally a 72-hour leadway in terms of the time that it took for threat actors to start scanning and when defenders started scanning to identify their weaknesses. And then with Spring for Shell, we already, it was just as equally as bad, where it was over a day where they had that lead time. And that just goes to show you that the amount of time that it takes. Now, taking a couple steps back, all right, well, what's really happening over the course of the past 2 years? And there's really a major element that, or tipping point, that happened in 2019, where threat actors started to change their tactics in terms of being more organized and being more surgical with their types of attacks. And in November of 2019, there was a famous ransomware gang called Maze Group, which continues to proliferate today. They've been started implementing double extortion tactics, where they were implementing DDoS attacks, and they were doing credential stuffing, leveraging vulnerability exploits and multiple different attack vectors to enter into the environment and then effectively exploit and blackmail the organization. So even if you could decrypt the ransomware payload that was executed and get access to your files, they still had access to it, and they had access to sensitive information, which most organizations would have someone out there in the world that would pay a hefty amount of money to not have that information be exposed. And this is really something that's been evolving over the course of pre-2016, in terms of the criminals starting to organize, going through their own digital transformation, getting access to more automated tools, getting access to open source artificial intelligence, and getting access to even the National Security Agency tools that were exposed back in 2016, which they now are proliferating and are on multiple iterations since then. And from there, this combined with the not only so the pandemic and a lot of different major events, more organizations working from home, a much vast attack surface that has occurred, and then the evolution of more and more devices has resulted in really all the things that you're starting to see in the front page of the newspaper. And it's becoming more and more of these more criminals are running into this area. They're working with nation states and vice versa, and they're heavily looking for the weakest target, because time is money. And the more that you can make yourself a harder target, and the more that you can filter out kind of the internet crap that's out there that you don't need to know, will help with identifying all the different weak signals that are out there that you can zone in on and actually get more information on, in terms of getting ahead of these opportunistic attacks and have it be that early warning sign. So the other thing that I'll expand on is threat actors have evolved into going from a 1-to-1 ratio to a 1-to-many. And they've identified that within the software supply chain, they're able to implement supply chain attacks. So during that same time frame that you just saw, where the ransomware epidemic started to take off, the supply chain attacks increased at the same exact tilt. If I actually overlaid those on top of each other, they would be in lockstep with each other, because of the shifts of tactics that threat actors have. And just in the time frame between May of 2019 and May of 2020, the supply chain attack sector grows over 430%. And just in the past 2 years, from May 2020 to April of 2022, so today, it increased over 2,800. So you can see the mass increase that has occurred in some of these major attacks, these major, not only a major supply chain attacks, but the overall increase in third-party risk, and also the just the adaptation of more and more celebrity vulnerabilities. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the man of the hour, Andrew Barnes.
Hey, thanks. So the way that a lot of what Brad described just now, the fact that there is lots of data, lots of computers, lots of vulnerabilities in the software that's running on those computers, has resulted in a number of problems. And one of the problems is that the internet is extremely noisy now. The internet has always been somewhat noisy, but the internet is actually noticeably noisier now than it has been before. We have here on the right a GIF of actual internet background noise coming from all of the different blocks of the routable IPv4 space. And the darker the pixel, the more noise we've seen from that network on the internet. This is, I think, a GIF of about a year of data that we condensed together. Look, every day, every single IP address that's sitting on the internet gets saturated with, basically anything from scans to crawls to vuln checks to actual exploits and attacks. And this happens to everyone. It's actually not just happening to any one organization. It happens to everyone on the internet all the time. And it happens from, it's generated by good guys and bad guys. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But the bad guys are pretty obvious, right? This is, your malicious actors that are attempting to opportunistically compromise as many devices as they possibly can around the globe and really kind of streamline or optimize their process of gaining access to systems to do nefarious stuff, right? Whether that's ransomware or something else. Bad guys use, they're scanning, crawling, attacking the entire internet all the time in order to credential stuff, check for proxies, brute force hosts, exploit devices, exploit vulnerabilities, etc. But good guys actually also use it, scan the internet and also contribute to making the internet noisier. In order to bring you web search and to also introduce the entirety of the attack surface monitoring, an attack surface management sub-industry of cybersecurity. These two things together just culminate to make an impact that the internet's really, really noisy. And look, to summarize a lot of, I think, what we were describing and what Brad was describing earlier, every other month now, there's a new really big bad vulnerability that keeps coming out and is identified, disclosed, weaponized, and exploited at scale very quickly in some piece of internet-facing software, perimeter-facing software, and nobody has any idea what to do about it, right? And we've seen this movie a few times before this year, but it's going to continue happening. And that's just the unfortunate reality that we live in. I am not here to scare anyone. I have no intention of doing that, but it will continue to happen, right? And the folks that are in here that have been working in security for a long time, or the folks that are working in a SOC, you guys are already feeling this, right? Like, you guys are already experiencing this. You guys are living this every day. We are citing some research in here, according to IBM, that we grabbed, which is basically scan and exploit has become an actual top exploitation vector, or and it's right kind of getting up there with the classics, spear phishing, etc. Look, this is a really quick eye chart of the celebrity vulnerabilities, not all of the vulnerabilities. Brad covered that earlier, but just celebrity vulnerabilities over the last less than 10 years. And you can see here that right there in 19, unclear what happened necessarily, but a lot more celebrity vulnerabilities started coming out. Does that mean that the security community got better at marketing? Maybe. But what it also means is that, and when you actually scrutinize a lot of these vulnerabilities, they are really bad. And so there's some amount of it, which is, sure, the industry is, we love getting scared about stuff, but separately, the data does not lie. The amount of vulnerabilities that are coming out, the named ones and the ones that are running in popular pieces of software that are very widely deployed across the internet, is actually increasing, regrettably. So I want to really briefly talk about why internet-wide vulnerability exploitation is so easy and what it means, right? So I mentioned earlier this concept of internet background noise. Internet background noise is basically just the byproduct or the exhaust of everyone who's scanning, crawling, and sometimes exploiting vulnerabilities on people's perimeters all the time, all around the internet. One of the reasons that this is happening so much now is that it's just really easy to do. Vulnerability research has evolved a lot in the last 20 years. We've got stuff like Metasploit. We've got stuff like all kinds of new tool chains, new debugging tools, reverse engineering tools, vulnerability research tools, etc. And the corpus of knowledge around it has expanded quite a bit. The attack surface has just increased. There are simply more computers, and we're running more software on those computers. And the notion of mass scanning is not new, but it's evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. It used to be that the idea of scanning the entire internet was insane. According to people, probably 20 years ago, they'd say port scanning the internet, like the whole internet, that's going to take forever. It's going to take it's going to take years. It's going to take months, right? And then, mass scan came out, less than 10 years ago, and you can scan the entire internet on a port for, in less than a few minutes. ZMAP came out. There are entire companies that do nothing but scan the internet, or that's a big component of what they do. Getting recyclable IPs is now computer easy. It's API driven. You can just tell a computer, hey, give me a new IP address. The internet is literally faster, right? And there are, like I said, there's a ton of services that'll just do it for you. So figuring out what software is running on the internet and figuring out how to find vulnerabilities in software, both of those things getting better together. And now it's really easy to exploit vulnerabilities at scale. Anyone can do it. It's not really that hard anymore, unfortunately. So this is part of our theory at Great Noise of why vulnerability, of why internet-wide exploitation, why mass exploitation and internet background noise is getting worse. So the way that bad guys used to kind of think about things, and as a former kind of bad guy, I also remember thinking about things this way. We used to kind of think about, bad guys used to think about the world in this sort of, who am I going after? What's the target? Okay, I need to learn everything that I can about the target, identify the target, enumerate them, find the vulnerabilities in the software that they're running, develop an exploit, or maybe if they already have one, then if there's already one on the shelf, then great, weaponize something that's already there, fire it off, emulate the target as much as you possibly can so that you can ensure success, get in, operate, do whatever, profit, right? Now, this is still the case, obviously, for many groups, but the paradigm has actually changed now. So bad guys are actually experiencing this sort of new workflow that is more of, hey, instead of starting with a target, let's start with a vulnerability and let's scan the internet to find everyone who is running the software that's vulnerable all the time. And let's compromise as many systems as possible across the globe. It doesn't matter if it's inside of a target that we care about or not, right? It's pretty much irrelevant to us. It's a numbers game. So now let's compromise as many hosts as possible. Let's deconflict our accesses, which is to say, okay, hey, I've got an access inside this organization, and this organization, it may be interesting to me, and it may not be interesting to me, whatever. And now I'm going to take all the accesses to all these organizations that I have, and I'm going to maybe use them and operate them on them myself. Maybe I'm going to sell them to my buddy. Maybe I'm going to trade them. Maybe I'm going to move them around. There are entire marketplaces for this kind of stuff. And the organizations that are doing the real, doing a lot of the damage are, they run like well-oiled machines on this kind of stuff. So defender automation is great, and it has come a long way. Attacker automation has also come quite a bit. The point that I want to get at here, that I'm really driving home, is that the threat model has changed a little bit in a way that I don't believe defenders, or at least not existing security products, have not necessarily caught up quite yet, right? It used to be, just threat model 101. Some actor cares about, some actor does this thing to one of our assets, resulting in this undesired outcome because they're motivated by ABC, XYZ. Grossly oversimplifying threat modeling, right? But now the asset kind of increasingly refers to kind of the entire internet, right? And so now we're starting to say this sentence more and more often. Someone does an exploits a vulnerability to the entire internet. That's all of us. That's everyone on this call right now, resulting in lots of shells, right? And lots of chaos and lots of confusion. So this is something that I believe is true. This is the way that we think about this a little bit at Great Noise. And I do not believe necessarily that every security product has caught up to this quite yet. And so I'm excited that it looks like we're starting to slowly move in that direction. And this is certainly the direction we're moving in at Great Noise, but this is at least a big part of the problem that we're solving. So I mentioned before that the internet was super noisy and that it was a lot of bad, but it was also a lot of good. I do think that it's worth calling out explicitly, like, what is good internet background noise, right? Like, what does that even mean? Right here, I've basically got just a really quick list of, probably looks like, about 50, somewhere between 50 and 100 benign security companies or organizations or actors that are scanning, crawling the internet, right? This is not all bad. These are security companies, right? These are universities. These are technology companies. It's not all bad, right? Like it's the wrong thing to do is to just say like everyone who scans me is bad, right? That's not necessarily true. People are going to do it no matter what. And we get a lot of utility out of this, but managing this and staying on top of this and staying on top of where all the good guys are scanning the internet from is really tricky. And it's a really, really important component of actually preventing really bad kind of celebrity vulnerability level exploitation similar to Log4j. And one of the actors in here that I have on this slide actually did exploit the vulnerability for Log4Shell at scale. And they were doing that completely just because that was the only way that you could get really high certainty of figuring out whether or not a system was vulnerable, right? And that caused, that was something that was really important to take into consideration for Gray Noise and for all of the different defenders, because the defenders, I mean, as you guys know in this call, you're having to make verdicts and make decisions and write up tickets and fill in, exactly what action was taken and exactly why, right? And so sometimes you just come to the conclusion like, oh, wait, this is just like Shodan, like who cares, right? We can just move on. But if you don't have a good baseline of where everybody is conducting their scanning from, et cetera, then you're not able to do that. And it causes a lot of confusion. It causes a lot of frustration when the Log4j, kind of inevitably happens, when the next Log4j inevitably happens, and when, vulnerabilities are being exploited on the perimeter at very large scale. And so these are some of the takeaways that we have. I pulled this straight out of Gray Noise. If this information is interesting or useful to you, you can actually find the IP addresses that all of these actors are scanning the internet from right now with the free Gray Noise web interface. So you can go over there right now and you can check it out. So Gray Noise is not the only organization that is thinking about this problem. We are thinking about who's exploiting what in the wild. There's a number of different companies. Rapid7 has AttackerKD. They're tracking almost 700 vulnerabilities. And CISA, as part of the United States Department of Homeland Security, is also trying to stay on top of which vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild. Our corpus at Gray Noise, on kind of a vulnerability by vulnerability basis, is we're tracking 200 vulnerabilities at scale right now. That number is climbing really quickly, and we're really excited about that. But the really cool part is that not only do we know which vulnerabilities are actually being exploited in the wild, we know exactly which IP addresses are exploiting them too, and we're willing to share that information with as many people in the security community as humanly possible, especially when things get really bad, when there's a really bad vulnerability and everyone is really freaked out about it and there is no immediate workaround or immediate solution. Getting that information of who's exploiting these vulnerabilities at scale to the right people is extremely important. And so part of what I'm going to talk about today at the very end is just how we're actually disseminating this data, disseminating this information to our users and to our customers. The quintessential example of this, right? The namesake and the one that you're all here for was absolutely Log4j, right? Like this was and continues to be a huge nightmare for us. This is a perfect example of a celebrity vulnerability in it checks all of the boxes, right? It's super easy to exploit. It's really, you could easily consider it a vulnerability in software supply chain, because it's not like anyone just runs Log4j on like a computer and that's it. No, it's part of a bunch of software that a bunch of different, programs are using on the internet. And so we took a ton of really interesting takeaways from Log4j. We were able to see it immediately. Brad was exactly right when we were talking about this. I mean, it was hours with this one, in between the world becoming aware of the existence of this vulnerability and the exploitation of the vulnerability just by the numbers of what we were seeing skyrocketing. It was actually hours. I have a note on here, interestingly, like the first sweep of exploitation actually came exclusively from Tor exit nodes. And that's something that we were aware of, that we realized nobody else knows that this is happening necessarily, right? Like a lot of the folks that we were talking to at the beginning, they knew that exploitation was happening. They were seeing it on their perimeters. And some folks were privy to the fact that it was coming from Tor exit nodes. But because we were collecting all this data in bulk and we were doing everything at scale, this jumped out at us, immediately. At the very beginning, it was wildly unsophisticated, right? It was just someone kind of found out like, hey, this seems pretty bad. I'm going to start trying to exploit this out on the internet, but not doing anything advanced, just kind of stuffing the exploit payload into like the user agent parameter or cramming it in as a username to try to log into a service or something like that. And we laugh about it right now, but it worked. I mean, this was, that was all it really took for a lot of different kinds of software to trigger the exploit. And shortly after that, it was by the next day, we started seeing application specific and product specific payloads for Log4j. That was how we knew, like, we knew that it was going to be bad, but as soon as we started seeing payloads that weren't generic, but rather bad guys that were attempting to exploit Log4j running in specific pieces of software, like running in anything that's super Java heavy and uses obviously Log4j under the hood for logging. And it was pretty scary, right? Because that was when we started to see, and we saw the complexity and we saw both the complexity and just the corpus of payloads just go up drastically over those next few days, including from bad guys, including from security companies, from good guys. It was really rough. And as the folks on this call here know better than anybody else, like, that was a really rough couple of days. That was a really rough week, and it's still rough, to be honest, and it's gonna be for a while.
It'd be easier to count the people who weren't scanning.
Yeah. I mean, it was I remember we went from a single handful of like just a few IPs to hundreds of Tor nodes to hundreds of IP addresses that weren't Tor nodes. And it was bad. It was really bad. So look, again, I have no interest in scaring the folks on this call. You guys know this better than anybody, but we should kind of expect that this kind of thing is gonna continue happening. Maybe not exactly this shape and size, maybe not in the exact same kind of way, but I mean, it's going to continue to happen. We were really fortunate that it didn't with Spring for Shell, that we didn't see like a huge exploitation uptick, but we did see enough to know, like, yep, this is being exploited in the wild, like right now, very quickly, very shortly after the announcement of that vulnerability. So what are we going to do about it, right? Like, how do we actually solve this at a technical level? So believe it or not, the whack-a-mole method of just identifying who is out there exploiting the vulnerability and blocking as much of it as humanly possible, it actually shows a pretty surprising amount of promise. And so I'm going to talk about that today. Look, at the end of the day, there's no better way to mitigate a vulnerability than to just apply the patch, right? Like hoping that the patch works, right? And that it got through a good QA process. But you really do want to listen more than anything that you can to the vendors' recommendations, because they know better than anybody else 9 times out of 10. But let's say for whatever reason, that's not an option, right? Or let's just say there's no time, or let's say there's no patch, or let's say the patch doesn't work, or let's say, anything like that. So beyond that, a modest solution to the problem is to run a gigantic network of sensors across the globe that's watching the internet for opportunistic scan and attack traffic and mass exploitation, to basically tune this system so that it is always tracking this behavior, and any upticks are made evident to the system operators. Make the systems look like whatever you need them to look like, right? You want them to look like they're vulnerable to Log4j, you can do that. Make the systems look like Exchange, make them look like Pulse Secure, make them look like whatever it is that's being exploited, right? Signature as much of that as you possibly can, and just run a race. Try to block the bad guy from hitting as many customer networks as possible from your network, or from my perspective, running Gray Noise. Get that information to as many different people who are making block decisions as possible, so that the actual, you may not be able to block it all, but you can buy time, and you can actually make the impact drastically worse, measurably worse, right? We're not here to tell you that this solves every single problem that you're going to have. We are here to tell you that this will, our method of proposing this will actually deliver tangible results, and we're willing to put our money where our mouth is.
Well, and I'll add to that and say, this is the reason why is because threat actors are identifying weak targets. Time is money, so especially within that golden time frame of the first 3 days or the first couple hours, they're trying to hit as many as humanly possible. And anything you can do to make yourself a harder target, the more chance you have for success, or not getting hit, I guess, is the best way to articulate it.
It's exactly right. Sometimes you just have to buy time and you have to plug up as many holes as you possibly can while you get a more permanent solution in place. And yep, time's money. Those first 3 days are really, really critical. So we run an experiment at Grey Noise where, just for kicks, we want to get some measurement on this to figure out how effective it's going to be. So the experiment that we run is that we put two systems on the internet, and both of them are extremely vulnerable to a number of different vulnerabilities, right? Like they will just get owned. You can just moonwalk into these systems, right? Default credentials, vulnerable to exploits, etc. And what we do is on both of these systems, the one on the left side, my left, we're going to do absolutely nothing. And on the one on the right, we're going to block everyone who's exploiting the vulnerabilities in that system, and also everyone who's, as many people who are scanning and crawling the internet as humanly possible, right? And we're going to see how long it takes them to get owned. And we're going to run it again, and we're going to run it again, and we're going to run it again. And we're going to try to figure out exactly how much time we can buy from folks. The results were actually mind-blowing. The host that has no blocking in place at all, it takes about 20 minutes for that host to get compromised on the internet. Now, again, a lot of the vulnerabilities that we were looking at were vulnerabilities that the world knew about. So that's not, these numbers would be different in that 3-day period, right? But this is what we're seeing pretty consistently. A system that's on the internet that's doing no blocking whatsoever, it gets owned in about 20 minutes. A system that is blocking as much internet background noise, malicious internet background noise, and as many people who are mass exploiting that vulnerability as possible, on average is 4 days for that host to get compromised. That's not going to save your life, but that might give you enough time to apply the patches that you need, right? And the other thing that it's going to do is it focuses your defense on the targeted, right? Because if you can spend as little time as possible thinking about the people who are just blasting out these exploits to the entire internet, and as much time really putting eyeballs on the targeted stuff as possible, that's where you should be putting your attention, right? Because only a human can do that. So the results were insane. And so as what we figured out is that, look, it actually works better than we expected. Like it turns out just this pretty, rudimentary method, it actually works. Scaling it is tricky, but it does actually work. And so, so we decided to get this into our product and make it, available to as many people as humanly possible. So we've opened up community trends where for every celebrity vulnerability that comes out that Grey Noise is able to detect, which means it has to meet a certain amount of criteria, but most importantly, it's happening in the perimeter, right? And it's an ingress, it's a server vulnerability, right? We're never going to see client-side stuff, et cetera. So basically, we're gonna track those vulnerabilities. Our research team is going to focus on collecting the IP addresses and tagging the IP addresses of everyone who's exploiting that vulnerability. And we're going to put them in a dynamic block list that anyone can subscribe to. And so with that, let me grab this link here really quickly. I'm just going to open this up and I'm just going to do like a really quick live demo. And so this is me opening up the Grey Noise web interface right now. I've got Apache Log4j RCE attempt. So this is everyone who is attempting to exploit Log4j. And funny enough, we actually see right now a spike of, about a small but noticeable spike in the amount of people who are attempting to exploit Log4j. We've got as a timeline down here, as much useful information as possible, but right over here on the right side. So if you want, if you know and love Grey Noise, you can click this button right here. You're going to see the same user experience that you're used to, where you can browse through and see all the IP addresses that are attempting to exploit this. But if all you care about is like, I just want this stuff to go away, I want to block this stuff, I want to block as much of this stuff as possible, we basically gone ahead and built a custom dynamic block list for every single one of these different vulnerabilities. So you can grab this URL, copy this URL, and if I just dump this URL right here, this is a live list of every single IP address and as close to real time as humanly possible that we can get of every single IP address who's exploiting this vulnerability right now. This URL will stay the same. It's custom for you. It'll stay the same, but it will actually, it will update with the latest IP addresses and it'll age off all the old stuff. So this is our modest attempt at giving this a shot right now. If you want more information about what this how this works, the way that we're actually bringing this stuff to market, the way that we're doing this with our enterprise customers, et cetera, look, go to this, create a Great Noise account, kick the tires, or just reach out to us directly. And we would really love to tell you more about kind of how we're doing this, how we think about it, the results that we're seeing, et cetera. But that's the modest attempt that we have, on preventing the next Log4j, right? So that next time we'll be much more well equipped. And when the next thing happens, we'll be able to just say, hey, everybody, if you've got any kind of blocking capability, next gen firewall, something in the cloud, something in the perimeter, et cetera, just pop a dynamic block list into this thing. And that's what we're gonna give a shot. And so anyways, I know that was a mouthful and I went about a thousand miles per hour, but Brad, let me turn it back over to you if you've got anything that you wanted to wrap up or.
Yeah, we got a couple of questions that came in, and we can address those. So appreciate folks submitting that. I'll also echo and say we have a pretty robust Slack community as well. So come join the conversation, and certainly, I mean, I definitely learn something every day. You can also follow on the social networks, certainly Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. So kind of one of the questions that came in, and sorry I missed this one when I was speaking. Is there a difference between crime as a service and ransomware as a service? And I'll answer that by saying, like, from a marketing perspective, no. From an execution perspective, yes. So crime as a service is really something that's evolved over the past, say, since 2015, so past 7 years, and it's a term of kind of the digital transformation, the underground economy that criminals have really evolved into, where they're actually becoming a business. So if you haven't checked out the Conti leaks documentation that came out, Krebs on Security has a good summary. There's tons of good summaries out there. It really dives into the business behind the criminal activities that have been happening. It's literally as a service. Like, just like you go on Amazon, the one click, like everything that you can imagine are in these marketplaces. If you have currency, there's someone out there that you can tap to help out. And that can be any form, which one ends up being ransomware as a service. It's kind of like a restaurant menu. There's access brokers or access as a service. It's DDoS as a service, so on and so forth. So it's the macro view and then double clicking into the micro view of the different vectors that are out there. It gets really muddied around kind of the mainstream media and marketing and a lot of things out there. The terms are used interchangeably. Ransomware is over 1/3 of the attacks out there. So that ends up stealing a lot of the oxygen in the room. But ultimately, it's talking about the same underlying element, which is the underground economy that's been booming over the past couple of years. The next question we have is, what kind of attacks can we see with Great Noise data? So we kind of talked about that extensively in there, but I don't know if you could just give a brief summary, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, anything. So I could talk about this for hours. The long and the short is that any vulnerability in a piece of software that is widely deployed, that's generally widely deployed, running on the network, so it exposes a service, right? And it's frequently facing the internet, right? And usually remote code execution in some capacity, right? Those are the kinds of vulnerabilities that we're going to be seeing. So remote code execution, facing a server vulnerability, network vulnerability in a piece of software that's commonly deployed and commonly facing the internet, right? You're not going to see a lot. Great Noise isn't likely to see a lot of exploitation of vulnerabilities in, like, systems that are typically buried deep inside of corporate networks and industrial networks and government networks and bank networks, et cetera. We're less likely to see that. We're much more likely to see vulnerabilities in exploitation of vulnerabilities that are in super common enterprise software that's supposed to be facing the internet generally.
Yeah, and certainly open source, which all the proprietary software out there uses open source, at least 99% of it. And that's really, it goes back to what I was talking about, the software supply chain attacks. A lot of those end up being, going after those underlying open source elements.
Mhm.
So the next question I have in here is, what stages of the MITRE ATT&CK framework do you end up seeing the most? We just started exploring and adopting this framework.
Yeah, so the two sides, and actually my knowledge of MITRE ATT&CK framework is like just a little bit dated, but the places that we're going to be seeing a lot with gray noise is it's going to be reconnaissance and it's going to be initial access. Those are the
Sure.
places that reconnaissance and early access are, it's only, you could consider it lateral movement if you consider that it's moving laterally across the internet. But aside from that, yeah, it's reconnaissance and early access, initial access.
Yeah, all the early phases for sure. How about data sources? So what data sources should I use to have better enrichment?
Yeah, so as a gray noise user, as a gray noise customer, if you're trying to figure out what should you enrich against gray noise, again, I would say anything that's feeding from an internet perimeter, right? So like a firewall that's sitting on the internet perimeter. It could be like any kind of single sign-on logs, service logs, server logs, web server logs, like anything that is IDS logs, IPS logs, anything that's going to be sitting on the internet, that's facing the internet. Those are the logs that you should be enriching against gray noise. Those are the logs, the events, the alerts, etc. If you get an alert on your domain controller that says that something bad is happening and you enrich that against gray noise, nothing is going to happen. And you're going to either feel very bad or we just didn't make what gray noise does or how it works clear enough. Advise against enriching anything on your internal network against gray noise. Advise very much so anything that's sitting on the perimeter.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the other question that we have in here is around integrations. So integrations with other core platforms and all that. Now, I know you're set up into a middleware platform called Tines.
Yep.
So that's certainly an easy aspect. You have your open API that you can leverage too. So it'd be great to know more about that.
Yeah, so the way that we kind of look at the world at Great Noise is that we want to meet our users where they are. So no matter what it is that they do, no matter what their stack looks like, et cetera, we really want to just make it easy to use Great Noise. And so the best way to do that is with the security products and the tools that people are already using that they really love, right? So if you're using Great Noise from an intelligence perspective, then you can use us inside of probably any SIM, probably any SOAR, directly inside the product. We integrate with Tines. We integrate with SOAR products that are actually fantastic use cases for gray noise. And then if we're talking about using gray noise integration from a blocking perspective or intelligence enforcement, then that right now, anything that supports a dynamic block list, so an IDL, Palo Altos, Cisco ASAs, Fortinet devices, and I know that there's at least a few others that support dynamic block lists.
Great. Next question I have is, this is from a SOC perspective, we can see that they feel the pain. So that certainly resonates. What is the sort of upskilling that the SOC teams need to keep the pace with bad actors? I'll take a stab at that first, and I'll hand it over to you, Andrew. But I think you got to start on a good foundation. So certainly, I'm obviously a big believer in this, and being able to cut out a lot of this crap. You start from a better known good. So certainly working in the SOC over the many years, over half of the alerts that we ended up having was false positives. So let's say on average, triaging an alert, it takes up to 15 minutes, give or take. It's 15 minutes times how many false positives you have for the day. So you're literally already out the gate down like a single head count across your entire SOC. And not to mention all the morale and indirect aspects of that. So cutting all that crap out really is going to give you a good solid foundation. And then really it's assessing your environment and really addressing what are the core use cases that you have for your organization, specifically your organization, knowing what your assets are, having that business context in there, and identifying where you are today, where you want to be tomorrow, and then closing that gap over time. Because a lot of people take a heavyweight approach towards this, and they spend a lot of time giving people certifications, going through all these different elements, and it's like it needs to be a more lightweight approach. But what do you think, Andrew?
I would just double down on exactly what you said on having a strong foundation. Like for me, the most important thing that you can do is to start by knowing yourself, and then start by exercising the primitives. So I would just say, like, more than anything else, like, you need to know what you're running. You need to know where your stuff is. You need to know, like, at a high level, what your architecture is, the places where data is moving, and the places where your assets are and where you care about them, right? Like, so just knowing yourself is going to put yourself really far ahead. And then the second thing that I would say is exercising the primitives, like making sure that if you're in a scenario where you just want to be able to, if necessary, take matters into your own hands from a blocking perspective, so that basically, like, if handed the right information, you can sinkhole domains, you can boot computers, or boot computers off of the network or whatever, sinkhole IPs inside the network from the inside out and from the outside in. Those just very basic building blocks are really important. Those are going to be the most important. Outside of that, like, the thing that I would really recommend from the folks on this call, because we've got practitioners on this call right now, so, like, what can you do to get a leg up on this? Start holding your vendors as accountable as you possibly can. Like, if the products aren't doing things that you need them to do, you need to complain, and then you need to threaten to walk away. That is one of the best ways that you're going to find results. Is you need to demand results from your vendors. And granted, I can tell you, we're a vendor, we're doing our best. It is difficult, it is hard, but you shouldn't compromise. And you should hold the vendors that you trust, that you're giving your money to, you should hold them with really high standards. So I'd really recommend that, for what it's worth.
Yeah, especially if they're more of a marketing company than a security company, just to call that
Exactly.
out. I mean, there's 2,800 vendors out there. I mean, there's easily anywhere from 50 to, some cases, 350 vendors out there per segment, and I can attest to that. So just in identity alone, there's 350. Cloud security, it's rapidly approaching 200. Zero trust, well over 80. So it's just insane how much it's growing, and there's a lot of competition out there, and you gotta hold them accountable. So last question that I think we'll have time for. So I'm really digging Gray Noise, but we of course have to go find budget. So can you talk about pricing and how the pricing works?
Yeah, so we try to price as grossly simply as humanly possible. We've got an Investigate product, which is standard pricing for everybody, no matter who you are, and it's a very flat rate. It's affordable. It's $25K a year. That's public on our website. We have another product called Automate, which basically is, look, you can enrich as much as you want, unlimited usage, but not all of the exact same data is available. For that, it scales based on how small or large your organization is. So the lowest you could possibly pay for an Automate subscription is, I think, $35,000 a year. The most that you would pay if you're a larger organization is probably closer to $300,000 a year. So we try to price as transparently as humanly possible, because honestly, like, one of the biggest gripes when I was a practitioner, like, one of the biggest gripes that I had with a lot of vendors that I was working with is, like, just grotesque pricing at, like, opacity. So, like, just no one telling me, like no one letting me use the product, first of all, and then no one telling me how much it was going to cost. And so we try to make our products as affordable as we can make them, but we try to be as transparent about pricing as possible. So granted, I get that people have to find the budget. My promise to everybody is, if our product doesn't pay for itself, you're not going to have to fire us. We're going to want to fire us, right? So, like, the product needs to pay for itself. We're doing something wrong if it isn't. And if you ever lose sight of that once becoming a customer, ask us to prove to you again how we've paid for ourselves, right? And that's something that we need to do, and we have to put our money where our mouth is, and you should do the same with all of your other vendors as well.
Perfectly said. So this concludes the webinar. So thank you everyone for joining. We certainly appreciate it. Check out Gray Noise, and this has been recorded. So if you want to check back again or share, greatly appreciate it.
I just wanted to say thanks everybody for coming and listening to us gab for a while. So appreciate it all very much. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Andrew and Brad, for your great presentation, and to Great Noise for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.